I would love to just first ask if you could introduce yourself and the OF Group.
Sure. Thank you, Jack. Good morning, first of all, and happy to be here with you today. My name is Oscar Fernandez, a licensed customs broker and director of OF Group, customs brokerage business in Laredo, Texas, and Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. Thank
Awesome.
you, Jack.
Thank you very much, Oscar. And, a customer that we've spent a ton of time with, a lot of time talking to. I would love if you could just start with kind of the story, the founding story of OF Group and how you got your own start in brokerage.
Absolutely. Basically, we started, my great-grandfather started our family business back in 1928 in the beautiful port of Veracruz, Mexico, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, there on the West Coast. This was obviously a long time ago. Basically, imports from Europe into Mexico, and along the line, my grandfather, actually no, his brother took the business, the leadership, and a few years after that, my grandfather, Oscar Fernandez, he took that company. He moved from Veracruz to Nuevo Laredo, and as a Mexican licensed customs broker, and then my father, another Oscar in the family business. And then I'm here, Oscar the Third, in Laredo. So that's our flagship service. I have to say, Jack, customs clearances and customs services, both Mexico and U.S., both southbound and northbound. We've recently shifted also into the trucking industry. We have our own fleet of Mexican and U.S. trucks. So
Yep.
We're trying to offer this complete, integral supply chain service, door to door, from not only customs brokerage and but other logistical services, and for the same industry, the same customer base.
Yeah, that's
We are.
awesome. Thank you very much for sharing. And maybe one of the ways that we can talk about, sort of the expansion of the business. What I love about brokerages, especially border brokerages and folks that we know from Laredo, is that there's often this like deep, rich family history in brokerage. Comes over frequently from the Mexican side, and then of course we've got this kind of sister cities situation with Laredo and Nuevo Laredo being one of the most prominent examples. But it gives you such a deep knowledge of folks on kind of both sides of the equation and what they're looking for and what it is that we need to do to sort of specifically move this freight in the best way possible. Maybe you could share a story, and if this, leads into, why you began, sort of expanding into trucking and more of the full service logistics offering. Maybe you could share a story of a customer or, something that you think really reflects the way that you guys serve clients, and maybe focus on some of the differences between some of these big sort of mechanistic, companies versus like what it really means to work with a group like OF.
So I have to start off saying that the border is a very unique region, the southern border with Mexico, and not only in a cultural way, but in a geographical way. That changes our profession in a very unique way, in the sense that we need to consider not only U.S. customs, we need to consider other international trade necessities and barriers, such as Mexican customs and obviously trucking or transportation. So that's the model we're building, trying to offer a single stop shop solution for our customers, and offering them everything that they need to get and do in order to move their goods, either import them into Mexico or import them to the U.S. Our warehouse is there, our yard is there, our truck drivers are there. We have our own fleet, so they're licensed in Mexico and in the U.S.
And I would imagine, as you start to sort of consume some of the additional, services around moving the freight, that gives you guys a lot better sort of overarching picture. One thing that I hear from a lot of folks on the border is that, when you're clearing freight in Laredo, you've got a very, very short timeline, really quick communication cycles, things kind of flying around from all directions. My assumption would be that, you guys get a lot more communicability and a lot more ability to plan and consistently deliver as a result of that. But anything that you would add there around, what it's been like to sort of add the additional service?
That's totally right. I mean, we're thinking of just connecting all the different divisions and the different services into one single experience. And you hit it. Laredo shipments need to cross the same day. That's an absolute necessity. They get stuck a maximum of 3 days, and most of our loads get crossed the same day. But that's where we come in and pretty much offer a one point of contact, Jack, to our customers, and that includes not only the entry, but also the pedimento and the cross-docking and the warehousing and the distribution and the sorting and you name it. We can deliver anywhere in the States or anywhere in Mexico, and pick up, vice versa, pick up anywhere even Canada. That's another coverage we offer. The whole North American import, export, and logistical solution.
And with that level of sort of connectivity and complexity, I'm sure comes a ton of communications. And we know that, customs brokerage in particular is it can be very manual. And when you're dealing with customers, one of the things that we hear is that, there may be a group of folks who are willing to sort of change their process, importers that are willing to sort of work around what the best possible version of that workload is for the customs broker. But often, that's a minority of clients, and even if they are able to change, there's still going to be some level of attention given. I'm curious, before we started working together, what some of the most sort of manual workloads you were dealing with before, or some of the challenges that you were experiencing before you came to talk to Dock Unlock for the first time.
So there's always challenges, like in every industry, in every sector, in every company. However, technology is one of the resources that we all need to acquire and start using it to. Technology exists to make our lives easier, to get well organized, to have that internal control. Not only to minimize, to remove errors. The human error is there, and Dock Unlock exists, and to pretty much make our lives quicker, our reaction process, our service. At the end of the day, we want a quicker and a more efficient service, and that's what we've noticed. That's the reason we've decided more than a year ago to start investing in processes and software such as yours, Jack.
Of course, and we're often, when we start to get into the conversation about Dock Unlock, we're talking about filings, we're talking about paperwork, avoiding some of the manual data entry, and putting yourself into a position to be a bit more reactive, a bit more accurate, certainly quicker. But technology has existed for a long time that has assisted with, document processing broadly and some things, especially in customs and logistics. But I think there have been a lot of changes recently. And one of those, of course, has been sort of the introduction of AI. This is not a new technology. AI has existed since, we started talking about thinking machines in the 50s. But of course, there's tons of transition that's happened as we've seen sort of the more recent iterations of that technology with things like ChatGPT and, kind of additional LLM capabilities. I'm curious, when you first started chatting with us, what were some of your impressions of AI before we connected, and what's really changed about those impressions?
So I'm 130% convinced that we need to invest in, we need to innovate, we need to invest, and we need to use AI and services such as DocNox to make, not only to make the customer's experience magical, but also to help us internally. Our operations need to, there's definitely a time consumption, and there's definitely lowering costs involved throughout all of the processes. Not only data entry, not only eliminating that manual data input, but I'm convinced that regulatory compliance, more time. We have more time on our hands to start reviewing the information. Where before it was the traditional model is to get a piece of paper and translate that into a computer and then review that and then process that. There's the result is the same, but instead of taking X amount of time, just break that and it takes 1/4 of the time. And I think it's important to know that there's always that human factor involved. We don't want to remove that factor. We need our staff. We need people like you and me to continue doing other activities, such as reviewing and such as studying and updating and updates and training and calling the customer and post-sale talks and things like that of that nature. But for sure, I don't imagine myself going back to the old school business.
Yeah, it's interesting because we started working together, I would say, before, things went crazy in logistics and really started changing as the new administration came in. One thing that I'm curious about, so you mentioned, this changes the amount of time you need to spend. Of course, you still want people in the loop, both from a, customs regulation standpoint and reasonable care, as well as making sure that customs business is performed by the appropriate folks. But still, there's a lot of time that can be saved in that, sort of process that is known, the SOPs that need to be followed, and of course, these need to be really in-depth. What I'm curious about is, so we started working together, we really changed the way that I think the business operates, and then the environment changed. And I would imagine the places that you needed to spend time and the customers you needed to spend with, changed a little bit as well. So, maybe we could speak to some of the ways that you've been able to direct, company attention to customers that maybe you wouldn't have been able to before had everything been, sort of pointed at that same level of effort as it was before.
So something that that our customers do notice and they do tell us that we value a lot is the time it takes us to offer and to deliver a final service. Not only the savings part and the efficiency part, but the effectiveness of I just love DocNoc in that sense that it takes us. We went from 0 to 10, maybe to 0 to 3, depending on the shipment. Right? There's others. There we might go from 0 to 2, or in other cases from 0 to 6. But we're seeing that effectiveness with our customers. We are noticing that we're able to process shipments in a very, very quicker way.
Awesome. And I am curious, as we were getting started, What were your impressions of the onboarding process with Doc Unlock? Because this is, I would say this is a different kind of offering than most software. There's not anything to log into. This isn't a thing that you go train a team to go point their attention at. It's really something that is meant to consume, parts of the SOP that oftentimes are not possible to be consumed with other providers or with the existing technology that existed before. Were there any kind of surprises or unexpected benefits during the implementation, or overarchingly, what were your impressions of starting to use Doc Unlock?
Good question. What I do have to say is that when we started working together, Jack, more than a year ago, I noticed that the customization and the personalization of different profile customers, different needs. All customers have different needs. Some customers give you a X format, others give you a Y format, others have multiple lines, others have other partner government agencies involved. So that's part of the magic we're able to create for our customers, and obviously Doc Unlock is helping us tremendously with this by connecting not only by connecting the different programs internally, for example, with the parts tables and the documents that our customers provide, and with our ABI software, which is Descartes NetSuite. There's that direct marriage and that communication and that personalized reviewing of case-by-case scenarios and different operations, and that's something we were able to sit down and study and analyze and design each process differently, and at the end of the day the customer never found out, so this was 100% easy for them. And like always, at first you need to analyze what you have and start deciding how to move forward, but that was very easy. It only took us a few days. And again, that process never changes. It's always important to constantly review and think what else might be, what other change might be needed. But that's where you come along and help us out.
Yeah, of course. And you said a couple of things that I think are really interesting. The first is that everybody's sending all kinds of different documents, and the world's hardest thing to do is to have an importer change the way that they process, because it's not like they make this for you, right? They produce all of these byproducts, these commercial documents, it's PDFs, it's Excels, it's XMLs, maybe now it's steel and aluminum compositions and the way that those things need to have, different countries applied to them for melt and pour. It's the PGAs. It's, how am I going to go get that trailer number into my BFT codes on my FDA PGA? There's so many nuances to the way that these importers are processed. And this is often where I think a lot of folks struggle to recognize, the benefit that AI can have, because the assumption has always been in the paradigm of the old model of I can scan a document and I can get data. But of course, there's so much more that we're doing together before. And I'm curious, through that implementation, and maybe you could give me kind of a picture before and a picture after, but how has the product changed the way that your team works day to day? What were some of the things they were doing before, and how has that changed into their duties now, specifically as it pertains to kind of the operations management and the entry writing and audit folks that you have, still employed at OF?
So I could definitely do say that we have more time to focus and to spend on other areas that we might have not had that time before, such as sales, such as compliance, such as training, such as team meetings. Those areas are significantly important. They've always been important, but that's a direct benefit of DocuLock and AI that I think all brokers must have, and start thinking about continue expanding on that. And you don't want to have a company and a group of a team where you have an army of people just sitting down in computers and typing, and it's much more to that. Let technology handle that, and let's just focus on other things that create value to the service and eventually to the customer and to the company.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we need to understand the customer. We need to talk to them. We need to understand their own processes, right? AI, it consumes processes that exist, but the connection between you and your customers is so critical, and determining what they need, when, and how it's going to come to you, is a lot of work. And then everything changes. We've got, announcements, we've got Truth Social posts, we've got executive actions, we've got, CSMS notifications that feel like they've turned up to like a volume of 11, and they show up every other day now, and things change. I'm curious what impact this has had on kind of your relationship with customers, and whether you felt like there's been any enablement of your ability to kind of pivot and change as necessary, and what that might have looked like before.
Great point, Jack. This year has been for the customs arena folks out there, such as you and me, and the customers. This year has been, we've had so many changes. The rules of the customs game changed by far. Nobody would ever imagine we would go through all the executive orders and the tariffs and so many not only drastic changes, but so many of them hitting us by surprise, and not that with the time that is given to us to prepare and to implement. And I have to say, DocuLock has done a fantastic job in helping us in getting organized and giving us that control, those recommendations and those suggestions that your programmers offer, and that we're able to directly use and implement and connect with our other softwares.
Yeah, it's interesting because interacting with DocuLock, I often hear from customers, it's like, I usually, when I buy software, I buy a dashboard and I go click around a dashboard, and that's kind of my interaction with the company. But with us, I think it's much more that we spend time with our customers, and the software, it almost operates in the background. It delivers the service. It makes sure that it's sort of meeting the requirements that we've determined. But one of the things that we value most is sort of getting to sit down with the brokers, with the entry writers, with the owners of these brokerages, and really understand, what's changing, how we need to change it. And hopefully the software is enabling us both to, stay out of the weeds of what those different things are going to do as they're executing, and really focus on the higher level conversation around how customs is changing, how the customer needs things to be reported now, what customs itself needs and their own requirements, and then hopefully taking all of that and converting it into something that the ABI itself can digest, because that's another really critical party, who's constantly trying to stay up with all the changes. I'm curious, with all this in mind, you've mentioned some of them, the changes in time, the changes in people's attention, but what are the sort of most important measurable results that you've seen in kind of adopting DocuLock or changing the way that you handle entry writing in general?
So it's not easy. If it were easy, everybody would be doing that now. But it is important, and it is essential. It is part of the basics now. That's my personal opinion. We've pretty much remodeled our business flow, Jack, our procedures, our SOP. We've been able to pretty much revolve around that, and we are using that. I can't lie, we are using DocuLock maybe for over 79% of our operations.
Wow.
That's a fact, and we want to continue growing that way. But so our procedures changed, and now the users are so happy about Dr. Knock that we pretty much, it's part of the basic structure of our daily operations.
This is something that, like, everyone's talking about tariffs changing. Everyone's talking about, customers needing more and customs brokerages sort of stretching to meet that need. One thing that people almost never talk about, and we, of course, like, this is our favorite topic in the world, but the life and the way that it feels to be an entry writer. For sure, that is changing. And we're constantly looking to sort of help level those people up into, coordinating and air traffic control style roles for making sure that all of these things are processed. What are some of the differences that you've noticed? It's hard to hire entry writers. It's hard to retain them. The work can be really, really challenging. Sometimes soul crushing, especially when it becomes very, very manual. I'm curious what the differences that you've seen in maybe like the morale or the way that your team works as far as the entry writing team goes.
So when it comes to entry writers, which are our main base, operational base, they pretty much, we changed that mindset with Dr. Knock, and we have more time on our hands. That's basically what's happening. We're not only do we have more time to that. What does that mean? Stress goes down, confidence goes up, trust with the information we process and we file directly. Those are the things that we've noticed. That I'm 130% convinced that our folks here at the office, talking to them, they will never go back to the way we did business 5 years ago, so we get to have that communication directly with the customer. We obviously do not want we want to deliver a excellent service, and we don't want our customers to be we want to be on top of their shipments, right? But I think quality, the precise information that we transmit to customs on behalf of our customers, at the end of the day, is quality. Compliance is quality, and that old type of old school procedure, when you just were involved 50% of your time just data, inputting data into the computer, that's long gone. There's that's where you start seeing efficiency and effectiveness in our services.
Of course, and hopefully a little bit of fulfillment too. I think as we think about entry writers, it's really the ecosystem of future customs brokers, right? These are people who are interested in the space. They want to get their start. They're trying to understand how they can do that. Maybe they're studying for their own broker exam. And of course, if their first impression of customs brokerage is that I'm going to be typing things in all day from a 300-page PDF with 700 lines in it, all of which I'm going to need to go and convert into multiple lines now because I've got AIPA or I've got 232 or something else. That's a challenging introduction to the industry, and I think it can be a big retention challenge for a lot of brokerages.
So I don't think AI replaces us. That's something we do need to state, because there's so many people scared of AI saying, thinking radical consequences, but they're just not true. AI makes our lives easier.
Yeah.
It's like an assistant. That's what I feel. AI is an assistant, and I mean, you just you might not need as many people as before. That's a fact. That's a direct effect. But AI just not will never replace humans. I see it as a great assistant that is always available. No, they don't need rest, and they're always there 24/7.
Yeah, of course, it's one of these things that we sort of always say, which is, in the past, if you were doing 100 or 200 or 300 entries a month per entry writer, you're getting up into the upper echelons of what was possible, unless things are very, very simple. When you're dealing with complex entries, there's just a level to which a human can perform. And of course, when you get a machine behind a person and give them that enablement of some of the manual process, you expand the way that they can do things. And we kind of think of it like, it's almost like oil. It's like the cheaper oil is, it's not like we want to drive our cars less, right? It's like, I'm going to go on that weekend trip now because it's not going to cost me $400 in gas to get there. I'm going to go take more trips. I'm going to use more equipment. I'm going to, manufacture more goods. And I think we're starting to see that analogy in the customs brokerage world, which is, it's on a unit by unit basis. It's getting easier, cheaper, more effective to process, the next customs entry. But often what that means is now we can do more. Maybe we can do 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 entries per writer, but at the same time, they're actually able to spend more time with the client, and they can really, take that attention and focus it on customer service, on support, on taking on that next client that might scare you, but you don't have to necessarily go and find 5 entry writers right now to take this client on. You can expand the business, hire strategic people, and really put yourself into a position to perform much more quickly than you could before. And I think that adds confidence and investment to the business.
You nailed it, Jack. So you mentioned quicker, a cheaper rate, and volume.
Yeah.
That's a result. You were able to produce more in a quicker manner, and you decrease internal operating costs. That's basically it. And I applaud our staff here at the office, our underwriting team. I have to say, they're the ones in contact directly every day with our customers. They're the ones that receive the feedback or the new guidances regarding the tariff changes. So they're the front. Imagine having multiple fronts and information, instructions, and pressure, and service, immediate service, and at the same time, we're getting bombarded with very complex customs changes. So that's reality. And what happens is that when we have DocLock and other softwares integrated with DocLock, that's just part of the big solution.
Of course. Well, Oscar, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And of course, we appreciate you as a customer and would love to spend some more time when we get back to Laredo chatting in person. But thank you for doing this, and we really do appreciate it. It's been awesome to chat with you. And if we can be helpful, please let us know.
Thank you, Jack, for your time, for the invitation today. More than happy. You're more than welcome here in Laredo. Beautiful and hot Laredo, and no Laredo anytime.
We can't wait to get back and enjoying the next. My favorite thing about Laredo is the carne asadas and I think that it's a really special community. I know we ended the interview, but at the end of the day, I think one of my favorite things about that community in particular is it is a community. You go to lots of different regions in the country and meet the customs brokers. And customs brokers as a species, I think, speak to each other more, and they collaborate with government. They're used to associating. But there's something special about Laredo. It's the most brokers, in the country. And you guys are really, I think, very well connected in a way that helps the entire ecosystem get better. So we always appreciate the opportunity to get there.
Yeah. Different. We're just different here in Laredo. Small town. Trade is in our blood, and that's what we do. Largest port in the nation. So
Of course.
imagine that. That's good. We do have those carne asadas.
Awesome. Thanks, Oscar.